And that is also quite detrimental. That is something that is more likely to even generate greater conflict. So part of the definition of conflict is that it's also kind of that perception of somebody frustrating your goals. So you're working alongside somebody, you're working alongside them to achieve a common goal. You also are going about doing your own thing in the organization, and you might perceive that person is getting in the way in a sense. Okay? And that is when conflict emerges. Now, a key question for us when we study conflict, or when researchers, a long time ago started studying conflict, is is it something that is inherently bad? Even though generally we automatically drift to that negative connotation, and that conflict is something that is generally deemed to be something associated with negative emotions, negative actions, negative behaviors. But we are interested in what are those instances, or what are those circumstances that enable us to generate positive things from conflict. Okay? And that's when we start turning our attention to the idea of constructive conflict. Okay? So similar to criticism. It's constructive criticism. I'm not just criticizing you for the sake of judging you and bashing your work. I am doing it in such a way so that you can improve. Okay? So that's why it's important to apply that idea of the spectrum to conflict as well. And that conflict could be quite detrimental, and it could be quite negative, but it could also be something that is critical for us to maybe innovate and to generate better outcomes and more creative ideas. Okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind as we get going with this lecture. Some negatives of conflict, or some disadvantages of the emergence of conflict when people are interacting with each other. Obviously, as you might suspect, you could throw in some if I miss them, but it's something that is costly, it is something that wastes time, it is something that ruins relationships, so especially in organizations where you might be working on lengthy projects that might span 2 years' time. Can you really afford to ruin that relationship with marketing? No, you need them to sell your product. So those are some key things that we notice as being detrimental to conflict. If we want to dig deeper a bit to better understand the dynamics that negative conflict affects, we always talk about the collegiality between people and how much information they share and how much knowledge they share between each other. So I've been here longer than you. I am going to tell you the know-hows. I'm going to tell you the tips and tricks of how to do this job in a more efficient manner. Right? So when there's conflict in the environment and when it's taking a bit of a negative turn, it could affect that process of knowledge sharing and information sharing. Okay? And if we even want to dig even deeper and look at how it affects each person individually in the organization, so understand how it affects the individual who is surrounded by this whole environment of lack of cohesion, lack of knowledge sharing, a lot of energy and times being wasted in the organization. That's when we start going back to those concepts of job satisfaction and organizational commitment. When you're in an environment that is generally negative and there's a lot of conflict and negative energy going on, that could affect your own personal satisfaction and commitment. It could lead you to consider other jobs or other organizations. It could boost your stress levels. And it could also do so across the team level. So not only for the individual, but across a team. It could become like an infectious situation. Now, as we said, we also need to consider the positive or the constructive ways in which conflict could emerge. Some key things that we need to consider, and some prominent advantages of conflict, and specifically constructive conflict in organizations or in groups. It generally is more likely to generate a higher quality of ideas. So similar to, if you remember, our topic of teams, more diverse teams are more likely to generate ideas of a better quality. Yes, it takes them a bit more time to actually get there, but that richness, right? It's that richness of bringing in different experiences and different perspectives. That's what generates a better idea. And it's a similar thing here, in that, yes, it may seem like we're sort of bickering at first and we're all throwing different ideas and we might all seem like we're coming at it from different places, but that's us canceling each other's biases and bringing in different perspectives together. So that's how we generate a richer idea or better quality outcomes. Also, if we start thinking back to our lecture on decision making, right? we talked about how throughout the process of decision making, we always want to be kind of poking holes at the decision. We don't want to wait until the end to realize that the decision failed, right? So when you have constructive conflict happening throughout the process, throughout our engagement, that questioning and that poking of holes in our kind of ideas or our alternatives is more likely to happen early on. So we avoid a detrimental outcome at the end. So that is a key positive there. In terms of quality outcomes, we just talked about it generally, but it could also lead to more creative outcomes. It could kind of, because you're going through this process that is quite hectic, and there's a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot of sharing of ideas, and there's a lot of kind of, constructive criticism being shared. That in itself could be a reinforcement for the team. So that might generate cohesion in itself. So even though on the surface it looks like we're fighting, sort of, but it's actually kind of more of a bonding activity in a sense. It's something that could bring us together in a more cohesive manner. Okay? So be mindful of all those ways in which conflict could either be negative or positive. Okay? For example, knowing the details of these positives versus negative outcomes could be quite helpful when you're building arguments for your analyses. So let's say your case on the exam calls for you to kind of, discuss how in this situation conflict ended up being a positive thing for the organization, right? Let's say that this is the case. You're given an organization, and we're giving you kind of the back and forth between two people in the organization, kind of similar to today's case, right? There's a back and forth between two organizations, two people representing two organizations, right? So I might be like, explain to me how in this case, positive outcomes emerge from constructive conflict happening, right? So be mindful of those different avenues. They relate quite a bit to things that we've already discussed in our previous lectures. So decision making is one that is obviously there. Seeing the parallel in terms of teams and diversity, right? That is something that can be seen there as well. Okay, so be mindful of those. Don't just memorize the concepts just because they're bullet points on there, but try to come up with a conversation there. Okay, that's how you're going to improve your argument and your analysis for your case. Questions? Okay. Now, one thing that we also did to better understand, or to get a richer understanding, or a more comprehensive understanding of the general idea or concept of conflict, is we broke it down into two concepts, or into two sub-constructs. And essentially, what we were getting at is that, some conflict emerges because of disagreements or issues pertaining to the task itself, right? So I think you should treat this entry this way on this balance sheet, whereas no, I think you should treat it as that way on that balance sheet, right? So it's something pertaining to the task itself. That's what we call task conflict, okay? And then there are other kinds of conflict that are more rooted in personality differences or value differences. They are relational, and that's where we have relationship conflict or relational conflict. Groundbreaking stuff. So we have task versus relational conflict. Okay? The key things to know is that task, what you're looking for there, like again, if you're taking pieces from the case and trying to coin what type of conflict it is, the key thing is that the type of disagreement or the type of negotiation going on in that type of conflict is something that has to strictly do with the work at hand. Okay? It doesn't have to do with personality. It doesn't have to do with differences of character. I'm of a mellow temperament, but you're more high-strung. It's not something like that. It strictly relates to the task. Okay? So here there's actually respect between the two parties. They're getting along relationally. It's just they see the problem, the task, they see it quite differently. So it's kind of a very instrumental problem. It's something that is very specific to what we're working with our hands. Whereas relationship conflict or relational conflict, that's where it's rooted in something like personality. Perhaps it's a matter of miscommunication. Perhaps it's disrespect. One party is trying to undermine another party. So that's what we're looking for there in that type of conflict. Okay? Now, some key things that we might look for in our people or in the way we set up our work in organizations to minimize relationship conflict. Because task conflict, we generally want to encourage that, right? Because that is more constructive in nature. If we're debating how we should go about doing a certain project, that's good. Because remember, we talked about how that is going to generate more, a higher quality outcome. Okay? So really, the type of conflict that tends to be a bit more lethal or poisonous to the environment is relationship conflict. Okay? So task conflict within a normal range, within bounds, we kind of want to encourage it. We don't want people just kind of doing the same thing. We don't want people just, abiding by the status quo and keep doing that over and over again. No, we want to encourage new ideas and new perspectives. But it's mostly the relational conflict that we want to try to minimize a bit more in organizations or in groups. And that's why some key
Sorry, when you said that relationship conflict is not not characteristics?
No, it could be character. Like, for example, my character is different than your, like you're mellow, I'm not mellow, and
so that is relational.
That is relational.
Oh, I thought you were talking about, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
no.
task is not.
Task is strictly something related to the work. Work at hand. Relational conflict,
like, I don't
personality clashes. Yeah, I just have something against you. I just don't like you, and I'm going to pick a fight with you, right? I'm not going to support your ideas just for the sake of it, but I don't really have an objective reason. Okay. Now, some key things, some key avenues that we focus on when we're trying to kind of minimize relational conflict in organizations or in groups. One thing is making sure that we have a high level of emotional intelligence. We've talked about the concept of emotional intelligence and why it's important in organizations. So that is kind of something that you might want to focus on when you're doing your hiring. Okay? So you want to make sure that you're hiring people into your organization who have decent levels of emotional intelligence if you are an organization that values teamwork. Okay? Because that's your way of hedging your risk early on, in that you're not letting in people who are really bad with understanding the emotions of others and handling their own emotions. You're kind of hedging your risk much earlier on at the selection stage, okay, when you're doing your hire.
Can you tell someone's emotional intelligence by giving them those quizzes?
There are scales that assess your emotional intelligence. You could do that. You might also even kind of do it, like there are other situations where they make you watch like certain mock videos of situations where like they show you an employee go into her, like that's when I did during my MBA, an employee walks into her boss's office and she's complaining about the coworker. So they kind of get your reaction to that and then assess you based on that. So there are different avenues that you could take. You would do an assessment, some sort of assessment early on. Another one is kind of through making sure that there is a good level of cohesion within your team or the team that you're managing, so that could be something that could circumvent relational conflict. And another thing that we talk about quite a bit, so if you've done your MHR 523 course where you develop a team charter, and essentially what we're saying here, you want to make sure that you have the proper rules, traditions, and regulations essentially in place so that we minimize that relational conflict from happening. Okay? So when you have those boundaries in place that guide people on how to act in a sense, okay, and obviously within bounds, you're not really micromanaging them, or you're not really kind of being nitpicky and making sure that you dictate every step of the process, but give them some boundaries in which they can govern themselves and interact with others in the team. Okay, so those are some key avenues that we focus on when we're trying to figure out ways to minimize relational conflict. Now, as I mentioned, we have one key model that gets us going in this and helps us understand how conflict comes about. Again, it's really nothing daunting. The key things to note is that you generally have some source of conflict. So here it could be, let's say, two people are really just clashing. Their personalities are clashing, not really getting along with each other. That's where those perceptions start emerging. So remember the definition of conflict, and that it's not only necessarily the fact that conflict is happening, but it's I perceive you to be doing something that is against what I am working towards. I perceive you to be getting in my way. Okay, and that's where you start building kind of those negative emotions within yourself, and those negative perceptions keep kind of emerging more and more. Okay, so that's what we're seeing in that middle step there. And that's when conflict could potentially manifest itself in the team. Okay? So once I build those perceptions, once I build those negative emotions, and maybe that's also happening with other people in the team or the person who I am perceiving to be in conflict with, that's when we say conflict becomes manifest. And it could be there could be this feedback loop in that the more conflict that manifests, the more perceptions and the more negative emotions I am likely to generate within myself, right? You're surrounded by negativity. You're surrounded by a destructive environment. So that is only likely to generate more negative emotions and is going to make you paint this whole situation in a very negative light. It's going to make you see everything in a negative light. Okay, we've talked about that before as well. When you're in a negative mood, you tend to see everything negative, right? When you're experiencing negative emotions, you tend to see everything as being negative, right? And that's kind of what's happening here, is that this cycle is kind of vicious. It's reinforcing itself, okay? And then that's where you might end up with conflict outcomes, or essentially what we're saying is negative things, right? So those outcomes that we talked about in the first slide. So time was wasted, energy was wasted, money and resources were wasted, right? So those are all things that you could argue that could come about at the very end. Job dissatisfaction, employees leaving the organization, okay? Everybody got stressed out, okay? So again, if you have a case that is detailing a certain conflict that went on in an organization, and they're asking you to apply this model, okay? Those are some things that you might highlight in conflict outcomes. You're looking for things like stress, you're looking for things like job dissatisfaction, a lack of collegiality, knowledge sharing is no longer happening, okay? So remember those things we talked about in negative outcomes, those could all build in there, okay? In that middle step, what we're seeing is I'm developing negative perceptions, I'm developing negative emotions, and they're reinforcing themselves the more this conflict is festering within the environment, okay? So that middle step is your process, it's kind of the action, the verbs here is what you're putting in place, okay? And the sources could be things like, you know, it all started because those two people in our team had a personality clash, for example, right? So those are some things that you might kind of think of or take from your case if you're given a case as such to get going with your analysis. Questions about the model?
So when you say manifest conflict, it's kind of like you are feeling negative, so everyone just kind of becomes slowly.
I mean, that is part of it, but the conflict manifested itself within the team, and that the conflict really happened. Like, we're now really butting heads. All the negative processes are taking place now. Okay? And then that, feeds into kind of this whole negative energy that is going on again. Okay? But yeah, here we're focusing on kind of the actions. They're negative actions. So we're perhaps yelling at each other now in the team. We're perhaps starting to not listen to each other. We're starting to gossip behind each other's backs because we're trying to build alliances. Okay, so those are the types of things that may be going on there when we say that the conflict becomes manifest in the team. Other questions about the model? Okay. Now, as I also said earlier on, we're going to be focusing now on the sources of conflict, and then as we wrap up our lecture, we're going to be moving to understanding what are some things, or what are some remedies to mitigate conflict. Now, some things, the reason why we call them structural, it is because it's something that's kind of within the way we organize the work, or the way we organize the team. It's kind of within the structure of the team, or within the structure of the work, so that's why we're calling it structural sources of conflict. Some key sources is the first one, and you could derive it straight from the definition, is that, you know, two parties may have different goals, or goals that don't really align, right? So I want to do this project this way, but you want to do this project in another way because you're pursuing something else, right? So it's simply that. You have an incompatibility in the goals that you're seeking as two individual parties. And that is going to generate, or is going to be a source of conflict. Okay? By the way, those are good ideas for sources of conflict. Okay? So you can kind of use those keywords or those key ideas as fillers for the sources of conflict in the process. Another one could be differentiation, or kind of here we're kind of approaching it a bit generally. We're just saying differentiation, and essentially all we're saying is kind of you just have different values. So you might be more financially incentivized as a party, whereas the other person might be more relationally incentivized. Okay, you're someone who values cutting costs and cutting corners and making sure you get the cheapest deal and everything, whereas the person you're negotiating against is more about maintaining a good relationship, making sure that everything is done fairly and is of high quality. Okay, so it's something along those lines there. You might even argue that there are some cross-cultural differences that could come into play there, or some generational differences. So keep those in mind should your case, for example, call for something. Third, we have interdependence could be a source. So again, if I am reliant on you to get my work done, if I rely on you to get my goals accomplished, we have an interdependence between us, and that in itself, just by the nature of that, and we've talked about that over the past few weeks, that in itself is enough of a source of conflict. It's me depending on you to get to my goal, or to get to my outcome. Another one could be the scarcity of resources. So again, limited budget in the organization, we're both fighting over it. Accounting wants more of it, marketing wants more of it, so we're both going at it, we're all trying to fight for that same budget. There might be some ambiguity in rules, so that's where we're seeing kind of lots of uncertainty in the environment. Nobody knows what's going on, there's a lot of commotion, it's uncertain what is going to happen, so you're just kind of all confused. So there's kind of like, similar to how we talked about role ambiguity earlier on in the semester, this is kind of something we're seeing here. And then there's a lot of ambiguity in the processes and the rules that are governing our interactions or our methods in this organization. And lastly, you might have something like communication problems. So we just approach things differently when we're talking about them. We're more abstract in the way we coin a certain problem, whereas you guys need more tangible material, and you speak in more concrete terms. And that may be causing some problems there for the two teams. Questions about the 6 sources of structural conflict? So again, keep those in mind, know how to apply them to potential situations, how they can be seen in practice. They will come in handy when you're trying to figure out what sources of conflict you're dealing with in a case, for example. And now, when we're starting to work towards understanding ways to kind of mitigate or handle conflict and interactions, the first thing we're going to focus on is kind of the different styles or approaches people take or parties take when they're dealing with a conflict at hand. And we have it all mapped out against 2 axes. It's usually based on how cooperative you want to be and how assertive you want to be. Okay? So you decide what style you want to opt for or what approach you want to take in handling a certain conflict based on how much you want to be assertive and how much you want to be cooperative. You might want to be one over the other, or sometimes you might find kind of a balance. And that's really what we're going to be mapping out here. So we'll start kind of with the easier ones. We have the avoiding conflict handling style. Okay? And that avoiding handling conflict style, what's happening here is that you're very low on cooperation, but you're also very low on assertiveness. Okay? Here, what that situation might look like is the problem may be, A, it's not very important to you, so it's not really worth your time and your energy, so you're just going to let it be. Or it might be a situation where the problem could be important, but you just got to a point where you needed to kind of let loose a bit, let it sit for a bit, and you're going to come back at it again and handle it later on. So for now, you're going to temporarily avoid it. Okay? Nobody's going to be, asserting their dominance on it. Nobody's going to be working with the other team on it. We're just going to let it be for now. We're going to take a break from it and maybe come back to it later. Okay? So it could be a situation like that. Or, again, it could be something like, I just don't care anymore. It's not even worth it, so we're just going to let it be. Okay? Whatever happens, happens. Now, another situation could be one where you are showing high levels of cooperation and very low levels of assertiveness. What that situation might be could be something like you're negotiating with another party and you really value the relationship with that party. Okay? So what you might say is, you know what? This outcome is not really something that is detrimental to me. It's not really something that is going to make it or break it for me right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you have this. Okay? So here what you're doing is you're cooperating to the max. You're yielding to the other person or the other party. You're letting them have it because you're like, you know what? I really don't have much to lose maybe here. It's not worth it this time. I'd rather us work on our relationship and not ruin that. Okay, so that's what's happening in that yielding outcome or style. Now if we go up top to the top right corner, we have the problem-solving approach. And that's kind of your optimal one. That's the one that we want to strive for. And that's where, sometimes you are negotiating things that are very important for both parties. Okay? Like it is a crucial outcome for both of us. We both need this resource that we're arguing for. And we can't kind of do any cutbacks. We can't kind of go back on it a bit, and you can't go back on it a bit. So what's happening in problem solving is you're truly trying to maximize your collaborative efforts as much as possible. So A, you're cooperating to the max because you're trying to get as innovative and as creative as possible to come up with a good solution for both of you, right? And that's why you're also not willing to kind of take a hit. So that's why you're exhibiting very high levels of assertiveness. because you understand that it's an outcome that is very important for you, and you can't take any hits on it. And you've acknowledged that also the other party can't take any hits on that outcome for themselves. So that's why you're both working together at very high levels in order to make sure that you achieve the most optimal outcome possible. Okay? And that's what we're going to be pushing for. That's what we want to push for, is that parties opt for that problem-solving approach. Otherwise, you could potentially go for the compromising approach in the middle. Now, the thing is, that's kind of like a good midway point. It's kind of like satisficing. Like, remember the term satisficing. We're just doing the bare minimum just to get by for now. Okay? So that's what's happening there, and that both parties are potentially taking hits on what they're going to get. Okay? They're not getting the full outcomes that they want, or they're not getting the solution that they exactly want. But you know what? For the sake of moving this forward, we're going to cooperate a bit. We're going to take a bit of a hit here, but we're not going to take a bit of a hit there, and you do the same, and we'll just call it a day. Okay? So from the name of it, you're compromising, you're satisficing in a sense here. Okay? The disadvantage of it is, you're not really seeking that innovative solution that is going to help you for the long run. You might run into that conflict again soon. Okay? So it just helps you for now, but it is not a long-term solution. Whereas problem solving has more long-term potential. And lastly, we have on the top left corner, we have the forcing approach, and that's where you're exhibiting very high levels of assertiveness and very low levels of cooperation or cooperativeness. Okay? And that's where you've kind of said, this is it. This is my outcome. You're definitely not getting any piece of it, and that's it, period. It is something that is crucial to me, and I'm not going back on any of it, and I'm not taking any hits on any of it. Okay? So here you're definitely trying to get, 100% of that outcome, or you're trying to get fully your way here. You're not willing to kind of budge in any way for the other party. Okay? Now, some detriments of this solution is that it could ruin the relationship with the other party. Okay? So if it is a party that you're going to be collaborating with in the future, it could be a bit kind of shaky there. Okay? It could potentially impact your relationship moving forward. Okay? Some things to consider. Thoughts on this or questions about any of these styles? Yeah?
Could we be given like a situation and then asked which problem solving did?
Yes, you were given that in the case today.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just might
So-
also wonder.
Okay, so do we want to talk about the case and apply this right away? Yes.
Sure.
Let's do that. Okay, so case, give me Cole's notes on what went on in the case today. Very straightforward case.
There was conflict within two parties.
Okay.
There was
By the way, the names were a bit tough to so we could say Volkswagen and Porsche,
Porsche.
right? So let's kind of call the two people by their organizations' names, okay? And
And well, they had two different ideas to move forward in the company,
yeah,
and one was kind of set in his way,
Sure.
and the other one was like, no, we should do this.
yeah,
And then one of them like left the company because
Okay.
his idea didn't work.
Okay, so let's kind of, like the first question in the case was, what were the sources of conflict in the situation? So what were your thoughts on that? Yes.
They had a difference in strategies.
Okay.
Like the Porsche CEO wanted to make profit by closing down operations, and the Volkswagen CEO was focused on engineering.
Okay, so if we are to go back to our structural sources of conflict, what would you say are some key
Incompatible goals.
incompatible goals? Yeah, thoughts? Yeah.
They had different values and beliefs.
Yeah, I would say so, right? I mean, I think in the case they tried to hint a bit at kind of like their personality, or who they are as people. So I would say you could make a case for that.
I was going to say more so that one was looking to make a little bit more profit, while the other one wanted to give a better car.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of, you trace it back to their differences in values and what they value most, right? So one is more motivated by financial gains. The other is more motivated by quality and delivering the best vehicle possible, right? So that's the argument you're going to want to make if you're going to go with that there, right? But you could definitely also argue for that it's an incompatibility of goals as well, strategic goals in this organization or across the two organizations. Other things that you thought were sources of conflict
Can
here?
you also say interdependence, because they have to work together for the company
Sure,
and the plan to
right.
work, but they aren't.
Yeah, how will you build that argument based on the case?
Based on the case.
Yeah.
They said if Porsche, because there were internal rivalries, so then each company were too proud of their own standing, so then they would not work
Okay.
together that well.
Okay.
I think that's mostly like in the board of directors.
Sure. So yeah, what I would say the key thing to that argument surrounding interdependence is kind of that whole ownership they talked about, and that like this company has ownership of this company, right? So where you have that is a clear indication of interdependence there, right? And that you have this kind of like ownership. It was like 10%. They own 10% of this, you know. So I would use those tidbits as evidence for that interdependence piece. Okay. And then if we want to move forward to kind of talking about the rivalry, you might be able to put that under communication, I would say, a bit of the rivalry. You might make that case. The communication one, I would say, I don't know if it's as strong of an indicator here, but like I would definitely say those three for sure, definite ones. But you could make an argument for communication problems if you want to talk about rivalry.
Since there was an argument for all three, would you want us to put all three or just one with one good argument?
If you could make legitimate, strong arguments for all six, put all six of them. Okay, and that's what I was going to talk about, like in relation to the case that was graded. Like for example, the Mars model. You could apply, like for example, motivation and role perception were obvious ones, and and situational problems, strong ones. Ability, not so much. But a lot of you, they forced ability in there. Like the most creative arguments for ability. Like for example, like by definition, ability in the Mars model and in organizational behavior is like learned capabilities, and like things like cognitive ability, or my ability is the training I receive on something. But a lot of you were arguing for like, oh well, it's SNC-Lavalin anyway, so they have a lot of money, so that enabled them. It's like you look for a way to kind of just put an able in there somewhere, and you're like, the money of SNC-Lavalin enabled them, so they had the ability. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. So you don't have to force something if you don't see a strong argument for it. Okay? But yeah, if you could build a strong argument for all three, put all three. Okay? That's fine. Okay? But yeah, don't fall for the trap of having to apply every single piece of a model just because it's all there. Right? We talked about that as a bias when we're dealing with too little versus too much information. The Mars model was too much information. You fell for the bias of using every single piece of the Mars model and forcing it into your answer. Right? It's a bias we commit.
Yeah, but about the ability, we can say that still they can learn some advantage from the corrupted society or corrupted situation. No?
Absolutely.
Because still humanity have an ability.
They didn't learn anything. They kept doing more and more corrupt stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, actually, to be fair, I think there was one student that you mentioned kind of like, because they got away with it so many times, they learned that this works. I gave them some benefit of the doubt there, and they're like, okay, there's something that was learned there. But it's also kind of something that's more, it's more of a suitable argument for, I would say, situational factors and role perceptions, I would say. So, yeah, ability, for example, not a great one. So, that's an example of that. Okay. Now, the other part of the case was asking you which conflict handling style did they opt for. So, what are your thoughts? Who wants to take this?
I think that it would be forced because Paul was kind of like reluctant to join Volkswagen. That's what she said. Paul was like that.
Okay.
They had no choice, but they had to like give the company over to Volkswagen.
Okay. Thoughts? Sorry.
I think also it was, I think Ali secretly bought more shares, or was it those two bought more shares in Volkswagen so they could force their ideas on all the other Porsche.
So you agree that's forcing?
Yeah.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Didn't he kind of like yield a little bit, like?
Give me arguments.
Like.
What is the key piece of evidence, or what is the key action that made you feel?
Well, he left, right?
Okay.
He quit, or he didn't quit. He got let
Okay.
go, whatever. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
And so you just kind of like, yeah, whatever. And
Okay. So we have two possibilities, and they're on opposite sides of the graph. So, any other thoughts on what conflict handling style was manifest here?
I don't think that there was high cooperativeness though at all.
No,
So,
no. I would say we could definitely rule that out
Yeah.
because like the case didn't really flesh out like any strategic sessions that they sat through where they really like planned their way moving forward. No, yeah, I think like that is safe to say is that probably compromising and problem solving. Not really. We didn't see any of that. Avoiding. Probably also not an obvious one because things happen. Like it wasn't just let to simmer there. So yeah, it's definitely probably either forcing or yielding. I agree. I read it as yielding. My take on the case was that I felt like he yielded, and that he was just like whatever. You do it.
Yeah.
You do you and all that.
Yeah, it's like the case clearly says Porsche agreed
Mm.
to. It wasn't that Volkswagen forced. Like it wasn't the wording was done.
Yeah, and although to me, I think you built your argument based on details earlier in the case, whereas I think we based it on towards the latter part of the case, where it was towards that very end and like what happened in the postscript or something, and that's what I based it on. Whereas I think what you and Zara kind of talked about was the details in the earlier part of the case.
in terms
Yeah.
of answering that question, would you want to address both the beginning and the end, or just what happened after?
I would say to play it safe, put your assumptions.
Okay.
And now you might say, okay, towards the earlier part of their interaction, we saw this, but then as the interaction, emerged towards, the end, we saw a change in style to yielding. Okay? So build your assumptions in there. If you don't want to take, or if you feel that you really saw both. If you really saw both and you want to make sure that you're making an argument, you can kind of take us through the process of how you saw that. Okay? Now, the different things that we mentioned as we were going through the diagram are all listed there. So it lists kind of each conflict handling style with its disadvantages or advantages, or when it's best suited for. So keep those in mind. And as I mentioned, also we do focus on kind of some structural ways to minimize or to avoid conflict from emerging to start with. And that's kind of the bit where it runs parallel to the structural sources of conflict. So essentially all it's saying is one way you can reduce conflict is by reducing differentiation, which we already know is a source of structural conflict. What is a structural source of conflict? Communication. That was also another structural source of conflict. And all it's saying is you improve communication, and you just need to know ways and tangible solutions for how you would improve communication within a team. So you might suggest things like, we're going to do team building activities, we're going to work on our norms, or we're going to work on our communication channels and traditions, right? So that's kind of, those might be good areas to ask you questions that are more action-oriented. So like, give me or suggest things that you might do as a manager to resolve this conflict, okay? So you might use those as guidelines to help you figure that out, okay? So you might want to work on your communication channels. You might want to reduce differentiation. So that's where you might argue like, well, that's where in our recruitment and selection process, we make sure that we hire people who are diverse, but they also abide by our core values, or they align with us on our core values, for example. Okay, so it might be something like that. Or if you're working for a multinational organization, we're going to do some cross-cultural training, perhaps. No.
What is Johari window?
I don't know why the book actually touches on that. It's like a very Oprah type thing. The Johari window is like kind of you deciding how much you want to share about yourself or how much information you want to release at a certain point in time, and you kind of like pivot or like you change that over time. So the more I interact with you, the more comfortable I get with you, the more I share with you, kind of type thing. So it's just, those are kind of examples of things that you might do in teams to help people create that. Not a fan of it. The book is an example.
It's just like a theory.
It's not a theory. I don't. Not really. You could tell I'm really biased on it. It's fine if you want to use it, but it's not.
Okay.
Like there are better ways to kind of like promote cohesion and better communication channels in organizations. Some key things, or a key always promote and we try to push for, and that's especially when kind of heated negotiations are going on, is we try what we call emphasizing superordinate goals, and that's essentially what we do here is we always take the two parties and we remind them of what their commonalities are and what they're both seeking to achieve, and help them kind of like diffuse that situation and not kind of keep focusing on the negatives and the differences, but make them take a step back and understand how they're working towards potentially a commonality, right? So there are some kind of like fringe differences, but at the end of the day, you're working towards saving humanity, right? But there are some differences in how you're going about it. So we kind of always try to make sure that we let them kind of see the bigger picture, see what they started out working towards. Other things that you could do, increase resources. Again, might not always be a realistic option, but you never know, it might be a viable option for you. Ensuring that, we talked about how ambiguous rules are a structural source of conflict, so we want to make sure that that is clarified and laid out as clearly as possible. Or you might try to reduce interdependence. So I am noticing that you two always are in conflict with each other, so I might pair you with another person, and then you're no longer dependent on each other, and that may reduce the conflict there, just by virtue of the change in structure. Okay, so that's potentially an example. Okay, so that is it for the conflict lecture. Questions about conflict? Okay. So let's start with So what I did is the grade you're going to so I graded those. What's wrong with you? I graded those. And then I was feeling nice, so I gave you 2 bonus points. So what you're seeing online is your grade with the 2 bonus points. And here you're going to be seeing it minus 2 bonus points. So just keep that in mind. Rishi. Actually, yeah, you guys are going to need to come up with them.
I have a question about an exam.
Oh, which is the final? Yeah.
Are you marking our exams?
Yes.
Yes, but we're all taking it together, every class.
All sections are writing the same exam,
Yeah.
but each prof
Marks his own.
marks his or her students.
Gotcha.
Yes, you're getting the same one.
I just wondered because they're all writing, we're all writing the same test, so there's only one person who marks them.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have a rubric, or we have the same approach generally.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't know if you've read my announcement or not, but my general approach to grading those types of analyses is, there's no forced rubric of like, I'm looking for you to coin that specific word and you're going to get 1 point for that and 1 point for that. I grade you on a scale of 1 to 5 for how well you develop